Castology.
Hello and welcome to the LIZCAST, the episode where I get to decide what we talk about, and if you don't like it, then soz, see you next week, I guess.
I mean, that's kind of all of our episodes.
Yeah,
like, you get to decide what we talk about, and people can
Yeah.
go away if they don't like it.
But I guess this time, you guys can't say anything because it's my choice.
Well, we're both pretty sassy.
I mean, you can say stuff about it, but you still got to sit here and participate. That's the rules.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Always.
So this week I decided to do something a little bit different because I didn't want to do it like a top 3 or a top 5 or a here is my list of podcasts. I didn't want to do a podcast
I'm scared
list.
of change.
Yeah,
Too
same.
bad.
Okay.
I did give you guys a heads up before, so you knew this was happening. Don't
true.
pretend you didn't.
What? But it was for the sake of the audience that I could seem
The
real smart off the cuff.
So what I wanted to do is just do each of us to give maybe 2, 3 top quick and dirty tips on what makes a good podcast, because we've been reviewing podcasts for long enough now, and in your personal opinion, what makes a good podcast? So one of my tips on what makes a good podcast is if you have a conceit, like a gimmick or a show format, stick to it. Like, I don't do too many tangential things. Don't go off into too many different, let's chat about how our day was for too long. Like, you can do that because sometimes it's interesting. But if your podcast is not 3 people sitting around and talking about whatever, then stick to your topic. Thoughts?
I 100% agree. My first one was going to be have a conceit.
Yeah.
True.
Don't just be, we're 3 best friends who really like
Having a
spending
chin
time
wag.
together, and we're just going to talk about random stuff.
Well, this is like, when I was driving on my way here, I'm like, should I have just done what not to do in a podcast rather than what to do? Because both of mine are don't do this.
Well, mine is have a conceit. Like,
Yeah.
people are going to listen. People are going to listen to your podcast if you are funny and producing good content.
Yeah.
But people are going to choose to listen to your podcast if they hear the conceit and go like, oh, that could be cool.
Yeah.
It's
Because
very
unless
unlikely.
you're super, super famous
Yeah.
and have opinions that are well known, no one cares who you are.
Yeah.
If you're
yeah.
sitting around with your friends talking about all the stuff that people aren't brave enough to talk about and nobody knows your name before this podcast, they're not going to listen.
There's a lot of people who are now brave enough to talk about all the things that people aren't brave enough to talk about. Like,
Yeah, you can bet that that there's at least 5 other podcasts talking about the specific things that you think that nobody else is brave enough to talk about.
Yeah, so like having a conceit is the first step. I think carrying that conceit through to the structure of your podcast and how you present it and market it is also a really big part. Like, if you say you have a debate style podcast, that's something that is aching for audience participation in some way, either through social media or through getting people to call in. It's a little bit more work because not having a conceit and just having a microphone on a table, you give all your friends beers and you're talking over each other, minimum effort. All you need to do is press upload and you've got a podcast. Unfortunately, podcasting has risen to the level where people won't just listen to that anymore because they can go and stream someone who's having stream of consciousness and watching something at the
And
same
even
time.
your friends aren't going to listen anymore
No.
because your friends also have 5 other friends who have podcasts and their podcast might have conceit. So you cannot count on your friends to listen just because they're your mates anymore.
Yeah.
Too many podcasts.
And that's the thing. You can have 3 friends who have a lot of fun spending time together and you can say, we should do a podcast.
Get a
We're
hook.
really entertaining.
Get a hook.
Figure out a hook.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we're going to be talking about, each week we're going to be talking about why blank is the worst thing that ever happened in the world. And
Yeah.
then figure out why it's the worst thing that ever happened in the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's my first tip is have a conceit and do that due diligence because your audience will thank you for it.
Tip from Nick.
I think my tip, and this is one that I have been harping on for a while, is if you can afford it, please invest in good podcast
If
art.
you're serious,
Yes.
if you're serious about podcasting, podcast art is so important.
Because you have to remember, right? People say don't judge a book by its cover. People still do that, and people do the same thing with fucking podcasts as well.
People have been judging book by the covers for centuries.
Can I put my finger up here? As a graphic designer who has a vested interest in people having good podcast art and also as a podcast network curator and as a podcaster, it is 100% okay to judge a podcast by its podcast art because
I agree with that.
it is part and parcel of how much effort they've put into their podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because every time we review a podcast, you'll notice that if it's got shit art, we will call that out. We never let that go. And that's not because we're being assholes. It's just because I'm like, this is a great podcast, but if I saw this little clip art thing, I would not have listened to it unless you recommended it to me.
Yeah,
It's because
exactly.
it takes more effort if you have bad art to get people to listen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think also just on the back of that, I would say, like for those that are podcasting currently, consistency is key. So obviously on the base of like having a conceit. So I host a netball show, and the whole reason we do that was because I looked at the space years ago and said, no one's doing this, we should do it. And we've been doing it consistently for 7 years, and we didn't really have much of an audience for the first 3 or 4 years, and then I do not know what happened, but somehow people started tuning in and then started sharing.
You keep putting out good, consistent. That was my other point. One of my other tips is if you keep putting out consistently good content, your audience will follow. They will find it. And also, like, you know, you can pay someone to do some PR for you, or you can, you know, have a really good social media presence. But if there is consistently good content that people trust and will recommend by word of mouth, eventually you're going to get there.
Yeah. And I think also that's one thing that we've learned as well, because our consistency has been thrown out with COVID, blah, blah, blah. People started being like, we started getting more negative reviews because people were like, well, we don't know when the show's coming out. I swear to God, 5 p.m. on a Tuesday, I had that episode up straight away.
Yeah.
And that's when people knew that was getting in their feed. Next day, they could listen to it on the commute.
Yeah,
but after that, it was like
podcasts like friends.
But they do.
And if your friend starts flaking, you're going to start not really wanting to hang out with them anymore.
And like the people that listen to our show are obviously they're very, very kind about it, but they are very vocal about being like, well, we can't keep up because the podcast is out this time and then on this time and then, you know, this is happening. And I'm like, it's hard to keep up with, obviously, but also at the same time, the lack of consistency also meant that we had listenership drop off. So when I looked at the stats, I was like, oh shit. And I was like, why is this? And then we started seeing reviews and people were messaging us being like, hey, when's the next show? And I'm like, right. It's because our consistency's dipped. And so I think you'll find a lot of people that podcast or produce will say consistency is what gets podcasts where they're at.
Yeah.
So.
And my last tip is get some feedback. Get people to listen to your podcast. If you haven't put it out yet, or even if you have, just get people to listen. I remember when we first started this podcast, we had some feedback that the format wasn't super easy. So we changed it, and it's been great ever since. Like, if someone gives you some feedback, take it on board, have a think about it, digest it, but getting opinions from the type of people that will be your listeners is super, super key.
Yep. And I would agree with that. When we first started again, the Goal Circle, that we did a run of 4 or 5 episodes where we had really heavily segmented, like, best hairdo of the week and stuff like that. And people were like, why the fuck are you talking about their hair? Like, we thought it was fun and it was like, you know, accessible. They're like, no, talk about the netball, not their fucking hair. If it's not
working, change it up. If it is working, God help you if you change it up.
Yeah, exactly.
Your listeners
we don't like change.
But yeah, the biggest thing that I've noticed since starting any of the podcasts that I've worked on is that I will always listen if people who are regular listeners give me feedback, and then we'll have a chat about it. And if enough people give the same feedback, we're changing it up.
Absolutely. I guess my final advice to people who are starting a podcast, not so much people who already have a podcast, because I get a lot of questions like, what do I need to start a podcast? And everyone's like, so what microphone should I get? I'm like, the microphone you get is not important. If you're worried about sound quality, you need to worry about the room that you're going to record in before you worry about your microphone.
Technology's so good, right, that if you are recording in a really good soundproof room, you can use your phone at a pinch and it won't be too bad.
Yeah. Phones nowadays are technological marvels. That includes the microphone.
Yeah.
So really, like, blanket fort, closet, small house. Bedrooms are great because there's a lot of soft there. You want to avoid a room with a lot of glass and a lot of like concrete floors and that sort of thing. just things that absorb noise.
Soft and cuddly room.
A soft and cuddly room makes for a soft and cuddly podcast. So, and it is really like, don't worry, don't spend a lot on equipment. Spend the time that you're spending researching equipment, figuring out what your podcast is going to be
You'll
about.
hear us say this almost every week, is that unless we know that you've got big Spotify or Amazon bucks and your sound quality is still terrible, it doesn't matter what the sound quality is like if you are putting out good content, because we realize that not everybody has thousands of dollars to drop on equipment, and that's totally fine. If you put out enough good content, then someone will offer you money to buy the equipment to do the thing.
Yeah, exactly. I guess my parting tip would, I think I kind of said it, I guess. Consistency. Actually, you know what? My parting tip would be, if you're podcasting right now, you want to podcast and you don't enjoy doing it, then don't do it.
Yeah.
Don't feel the need to go, I have to do it. I don't. But if you do feel like that, take a breath, take a step back.
Unless someone's paying you to do it as part of your job.
Tough shit.
But there will never be another Joe
it.
Rogan. There will never be another person who gets famous because of their podcast.
Yeah.
No, that bubble's burst.
Yeah. But I think for me, it's like, if you've fallen out of love, and I have with a few podcasts that I've hosted in the past, if you fall out of love with it, dip it. That's what I've done. And it hurts. It sucks because it's something you don't want to do. And for me, it's like, I failed to develop that. But that's just the nature of it.
Yeah.
And
because people can hear your passion, and we say this in a lot of our reviews as well. When you are passionate about something, you can hear that passion come through in the content. And once you stop being passionate about it, your listeners can hear it whether you think they can or not.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, thank you for this little tips and tricks on podcasting episode, guys. If you want to listen to our main episodes next week, we'll be reviewing the podcast that we recommended last week. And if you want to recommend a podcast or write in some tips of your own, you can go to, castologypodcast@gmail.com. Is that?
Yes. Yeah, that's our email.
And that's notcanon.com/Castology if you want to recommend a podcast for us to review on one of our main episodes. Until then, I've been Liz Best here with
Nick Bleeker
and
Zane C. Weber.
Keep listening to podcasts.
Hello, my name is Sandro.
And my name's Zach.
We are historians.
Well, movie historians. We're not qualified for anything else.
Join us on our podcast, Oldie But a Goodie,
where for all of 2022, we're reviewing movies from the year 2001.
That's right. Every episode, we look at all the movies that came out that week back in 2001. Then we pick one film and we do a full synopsis review.
It's oldie but a goodie. Sometimes, most of the time, we find bad movies.
It's usually a fun time, but also usually one of us ends up pulling our hair out by the end of the episode.
And we have a lot of hair between us.
What a selling point for the trailer.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty exciting.
Oldie But a Goodie. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
That's Not Canon Productions podcast.